My name is Dr. Gary Danelski. Today is Monday, November 30th, 2015, and I'm going to interview Dr. Sandra McPherson and Dr. Don McPherson as part of the Ohio Psychological Association's Oral History Project. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about each of them. They actually took rather differing professional paths, but these paths have frequently joined and complement one another. Sandra is a clinical psychologist, Don a school psychologist. Sandra has done a great deal of work in graduate education, child psychology, including director of research for 5 years at Cleveland's Child Guidance Clinic, and forensic psychology. She has taught at and consulted with several organizations and academic institutions, worked in various clinical organizations, and was appointed to Ohio's State Board of Psychology for 6 years and served as its president. Just to show how the level of her involvement, her Ohio psychology license is number 2. She had also served as president of OPA and served for several years on its board. She has held many consulting positions and is well known and highly respected for the great deal of psychological forensic work she has done. Don was educated as a school psychologist and practiced in that area for a number of years. He later became classified as a teacher, which is an interesting story in itself. Simultaneous with his work in psychology, he became active in the political sphere, working effectively for candidates at the local, state, and national levels. He, along with Sandra, has become heavily involved in the international peace movement and nuclear disarmament movement. He was actively involved in the development of Psychologists for Social Responsibility, that organization which is a very prominent organization today. For Donald, psychology has been his framework or orientation, but his activities have ranged well beyond those of either providing services to individuals or organizations, and we'll get into that more as the interview proceeds. Okay, first I'd like to get a little background information from each of you. First Sandy and then Dawn. What I'd like you to do is tell me a little bit about your early personal and academic life, where you grew up, went to undergraduate school, your major, your early career development, how your professional career evolved, and at some level, at some point, how did the two of you meet, which I think is an interesting question. So, Sandy, why don't you start on that?
Okay, roots actually go back to when I was like probably 3-4 years of age, sitting on my grandfather's lap, who took care of me while my father went to war. And my grandfather was fascinated with psychology, so he would read anything about psychology that was in the Sunday or in the paper. And I sort of grew up being interested in this area. Eventually, however, that was in Baltimore, Maryland. Eventually, after moving around the country, when my father returned, I wound up in the Cleveland area, in Lakewood, went to high school there, and went to Kent State. And that will answer your second or last inquiry. I met Donald at Kent State in a psychology course, of course. He was a graduate student and I was an undergraduate, and it looked like an interesting course. It was restricted to graduate students and seniors, but I signed up for it in the hopes that they'd just sort of ignore my class standing. And I still remember Perkins, who went to Emory eventually and was pretty well regarded, nice guy, standing up there looking at me in a fixed way and saying, some people in here may not get credit for this course because they are not qualified to be in the course, but we will see. I got credit for the course and I got Donald, which I thought was a pretty good deal.
2 for 1, huh?
That's right. In any event, the move into psychology, my father was an investigator, and that plays a part in it too. I grew up hearing about human behavior, and it's somewhat unusual.
What type of investigator was he?
He was CID in the service, criminal investigation. But in real life, he was a insurance investigation.
I see.
But I heard about a lot of rather bizarre behaviors long before other people in my age or cohort knew them. So the ultimate move into psychology and ultimately into forensics was pretty well forecast by the background. So that's how I wound up doing what I do. At this point, pretty much entirely forensic psychology. That's where my heart is.
Very good. Don, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your where you grew up, your early background, how you got into psychology, and anything else that you'd like to mention there.
I was born in Euclid, Ohio. That's most unusual. Grew up in Euclid. Went to Shore Graduated from Euclid High in 1950, went to Hiram College, majored in history, was drafted into the Army, so I am technically a Korean vet. Got out a little early, as did a lot of people, to go back to Hiram. Just stayed long enough to get credentialed in teaching. That's when I taught for about 2.5 years. Then I went to Kent, got a master's in psychology. That's where I met Sandra. We were married in 1960. In January of 61, all of 61, she served as a caseworker for the Child Welfare Department in Richland County. She wanted to go to Oberlin. They wouldn't admit her in January, so she went back to Kent. Graduated from Kent in 1963. Was admitted to graduate school in Reserve, where she got her PhD, and that's when I became active in psychology. In 1963, I joined the board of Cleveland Psych Association. Very shortly thereafter, I was elected. There was a division of child in those days, chairman of the division of child. In 1965, I became the newsletter editor of CPA, Cleveland Psych Association. I don't know how long I was editor of that. I was editor for a number of years. I know I got out probably about 68 when I ran for East Cleveland School Board, which I was also at that time the vice president of the Teachers Association in Euclid. By the way, I was most unusual in that even though as of September, I think it was 1963, I became a school psychologist in Euclid. I served in 1970, 1980 again as president of the Teachers Association. It was most unusual because most of those people, the people that were president of those groups, were classroom teachers. I was not. I was also active in politics with OPA and selected people. For instance, we selected...
Excuse me, but you mean OEA?
OEA, yeah.
Right.
Excuse me, I'm having some difficulties since this recent trouble I had. Yeah, for instance, we selected Howard Metzenbaum over, I think he was running against Stanton, and a number of other people. So I was active there. In '68, I also ran for East Cleveland School Board. Did fairly well, but came in third out of 7, so didn't win. And that was so much work. There was a lot of work involved in that. That's when I became involved in 1969 in politics, working for John Sweeney's campaign. I again worked for Sweeney in '72. He thought I did a good job, wanted me to replace him. I didn't do that. And I couldn't serve on the Board of Psychology. I got biographies of a lot of people, and then he and 2 other freshmen, what should I say, members of the House, Dick Celeste and Harry Lehman and John, ended up appointing Sandra to the Board of Psychology, which is, Gillig was very reluctant to do that. He took 2 kids and appointed them for a year. Then, as a result of a lot of lobbying from OPA, they were reappointed for another 5 years.
That was Bill Wester.
Bill Wester.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And yeah, Bill is still around. He's essentially retired now.
Can I make a...
You may, yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah. It's an object lesson for psychology, because when Bill and I walked in, basically the rest of the group was, where you all come from. We were young psychologists. We had no history of strong involvement with the group and that sort of thing, and it was like, you haven't earned the right to be here. But if we were active, both of us had been active in different ways on the political scene. And I think that OPA learned from that the way you get what you want in the body, out of the body politic is you've got to be in the body politic.
Right.
And psychologists still need to learn that lesson.
Yeah. Very true. Very true. Anything else, Don, that you'd like to say before we get on to the other questions?
Well,
and
I
so
do
forth?
remember that Bill was vice president of a college in Cincinnati at the age of like 31, and you had been active. I remember what board it was. Some board that was revising the East
Oh,
Cleveland.
the Charter Commission,
Yeah,
yes.
Charter Commission, right, in East Cleveland, before we were appointed to board.
Yeah, we
of psychology.
redesigned city government for East Cleveland with the naive idea that we could actually make the place better. And they accepted one of the things we recommended, an increase in salary for the people who are on not commission, but the government. And the rest of the things which would have made a difference, they decided were too idealistic.
That wasn't too idealistic.
I will tell you, though, it was instructive because on this Charter Review Commission in 1968, it was, or 7, something like that, we had the Black Power leader from Cleveland, a representative of old money in East Cleveland. We're talking Rockefeller-type descendants.
City manager,
Yeah. Young money, newly minted merchants, and a couple of, well, I think I was basically the not closet, but the liberal. But you put that mix together and then actually get them to agree on how to run a city. It was a fascinating and quite wonderful experience.
Very good. That's quite interesting. Very useful. Okay, now let's move over to Sandy for a minute and come back to Don a little bit later. You already described how you got on the board. Can you tell me more about your experiences there? As I remember, you were very involved in a very important process of rulemaking, the rules that had to be promulgated in order to enforce the law properly.
Yeah. Well, again, the legal interests. First thing I did after appointment was I was contacted by the lay member of the board who was an attorney in Columbus. And I said, send me the law. Let me read the law and let's figure out what we can do under that law. We've got to get a whole bunch of people qualified rather quickly. And then we've got to figure out how to run this thing. I also got some material from another state where they had 7 years study and found out that that the inevitable course of boards is to get more and more punitive and more restrictive. And I wanted to create, in the face of that likely occurrence, I wanted to create a legal structure that would be modeled on our general legal structure, which preserves the rights of petitioners and preserves a separation of powers, which I think is extremely important and was not done routinely among boards. So I said from the beginning, if you are going to be an examiner, which I was, that means looking at people's credentials and so forth, you cannot then sit on the voting process for acceptance or rejection. You've got to separate these to keep,
Very good,
you
yeah.
know. And so we wrote rules that were aimed at a separation of powers and the preservation of individual rights and due process. And due process is one of the more important things that we've got in this country to some degree.
Right. So you really had you were in the beginning and really setting this up. How well do you think the board has followed this over the years?
I think it has varied. There have been times when I know the board has been absurdly punitive, and sort of absurd. And I recall one period of time when the board was sending investigators into psychologists' offices with no warning to look at files. That is an absurdity, and it's outrageous, is what it is. You should have a probable cause before you come in and start asking to see something, and warrants and things of that sort, or the equivalent. But these were brief bubbles. I think for the most part our board has paid attention to the original notion that you preserve rights and that you proceed carefully. And now, if anything, I've actually consulted to the board on several cases, appeared before them to testify, and consulted with clients before then. And I think their procedures are pretty sound.
Yeah. Haven't had many of the major flaps that some of the other state boards have had. I know
That's
that.
right.
That's true. That's good.
So, and they've had good people
Yeah.
from the beginning, good employees, good solid
Right.
professional people.
Okay, now let's talk about your experiences with the Ohio Psychological Association. You were on the board, you were its president and so forth. Tell me a little bit about your experiences there, Sandy.
I was thinking about that this morning because I read that you were from your memo on that you sent me that you'd be interested in that, and I was thinking, nothing is standing out, but one thing does occur to me. What was kind of fun. I've often thought that putting a bunch of psychologists in a room, whether in Fielding where I taught, or here in OPA or whatever, is like the proverbial herding of cats. It's pretty hard to do. They just go in all directions, and they love to go for this thing called consensus, which is an unachievable goal for the most part, and not a very efficient way to get much done. I think what I liked when I was in OPA was a little more systematic imposition of Robert's rules, or the equivalent thereof. And a little more efficient way of saying, through use of agendas and what have you, we need to get from point A to point B, and we need to get there with a reasonable amount of concurrence. But we can't make everybody agree,
True enough.
and we've got to have mechanisms that allow us to move, and then to respond if there are some corrective inputs that people can give us. I recall working with you a number of times on events that occurred at OPA. I think you can remember some as well. Some of which required the expertise of psychologists who've done therapy, who can recognize, that there's more than one agenda, that there's more than one reason, and simply go forward.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Later, you became involved with Fielding Graduate University with online learning. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How that developed, and what your thoughts are about that?
It was interesting. I had been in practice, been doing a lot of practice with moving into the forensic areas, and I'd done a fair amount of research from time to time. Unlike a lot of my colleagues who were in full-time practice, I really always have had an interest in doing a certain amount of inquiry. Questions would occur to me. Why not collect data and figure out maybe there's an answer, or at least a way to enhance the hypotheses. And I arrived at a point where I thought I would really like to teach in a law school, and thought about going to some of the people whom I knew who were at Reserve and at Cleveland State to see whether some kind of adjunct teaching could be arranged in the mental health law field. And about that time, there was a vacancy at Fielding, and someone called me up and said, "Sandy, you ought to look into this." I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. It's different, and that was how I wound up becoming a member. And it was just of that faculty. It was just at the point that Fielding had moved into APA approval, and I think it remains the only online program that has that. That has the APA. What is it? APA?
The approval,
Yeah, and it Fielding, by the way, is a combined distance learning and hands-on operation. You cannot teach certain kinds of clinical practice without being there and interacting. And we would take the position that you can't even teach the more academic subjects without having some interaction between professor and student. And so we've always had a combined program, which, by the way, meant that every January, I got to go to Santa Barbara and teach, which wasn't really a bad deal at all. Lots of people offered to carry my luggage, all of them from Cleveland, go figure. In any event, that's how I got into that, and it was just at the point that online became more and more of a reality. So, in effect, I was able to participate in the emergence of the technology as it affects the educational process at a high level. And that was fascinating.
Yeah.
It was fascinating. It was challenging. I mean, I'm not as I'm fond of saying, I have computers around, I use them, but I don't play on them. The only thing I play are musical instruments, and I don't want to play on my computer at all. And so kicking and screaming, I was drawn into this
Right, yeah.
totally technological approach.
Very good, yeah. You also became known as one of the leading forensic psychologists in the area. How did you get into that area, and can you characterize how that has been like for you? And I think you've told a little bit about from your background with your father. I think that probably was a contributing factor.
I think that was a formative factor, but I was very close to my father. And I think we thought alike. Yeah, you have to have two different things in forensic psychology in terms of cognitive style. One is the style that goes into doing therapy, and that's the ability to feel with another person and to sometimes know something that's going on with them that they haven't figured out themselves. And you somehow pick this up from a number of things, which, by the way, the folks in neuropsych are starting to map. But it's still a covert process. So there's that kind of tracking with another human being. The other thing you have to have, though, is an enjoyment of pure logic and the ability to take some of the kind of materials that you're studying or interacting with and actually apply them to a question before the court. That is an exercise in chess or, it's strategy, it's science, and it's logic. Bottom line is it's logic. You start from here, it's fairly linear, you want to find out A, B, and C. You do not want to find out the general rule of things. You want to find whether or not A had a certain state of mind at a certain date, or something of that sort. And so it's very investigative. The kind of work I've done, Donald and I have done together a lot of death penalty mitigation. And that's street work. That's going out into the city and finding people and interviewing them and seeing if they're going to be good witnesses and provide the kind of evidence you want. So it's puzzles, pieces of the puzzle, and you put it together. So all of those are parts of what I really like about it.
And you say this is primarily what you're doing these days.
That's primarily what I do,
Yeah.
yes.
Sandy, what advice would you have for students anticipating a career, thinking about a career in psychology, or for students already in psychology? What advice might you give based upon your years of experience?
Okay, the old model of just going into psychology, hanging out a shingle, I think is done for, with a few exceptions. Those exceptions are going to involve high-level specialties. If you have a niche that you can get paid to do, and you like to do it, and you can train up for it, then maybe you can make it independently. I think a lot of the more clinical work is going to take place in integrated settings, and I've long been a member of the National Academy of Psychologists, or practice, which includes psychology and all the other major health professions. We have to be much more collegially interrelated with the other health service delivery people. I think we ought to be training one another, and we ought to be cross-training as post-grads, as licensed people. The fact that I have to get all my CE in psychology is absurd. Where I need to be educated is in law. So I go and get educated, but none of it counts.
Right, yeah.
I even teach in educational programs for law. I can't get credit for that either. People who are working in integrated medical settings ought to be learning about the post-operative mindsets and what can be done to help people who are recovering from this or that illness or have to adjust to certain kind of medical procedures. They can only do that kind of work if they're taking some medical ed, but that won't count either. So that's a major criticism I've had for a long time in the whole CE thing.
Sounds like you need to get back on the board of psychology and try to convince them to make those changes, because I know it gets pretty rigid, what counts and what doesn't count. I've thought about that a lot myself.
Yeah.
So.
But in any event, far as young people are concerned, I think they they need to plan to have a focus. And they need to look to see what focus, A, they want to do, and B, is it too well occupied?
Right, yeah. Looking back at your professional career, Sandy, what are you most proud of?
Well, the thing that came to mind when I saw that question on your list was a case in Florida many years ago, and I wrote it up and was published, in which a bunch of protesters had gone out and thrown some paint on a Trident submarine, I think it was, in an effort to end our nuclear. And I was, their defense, their defense in court included, who was the Carroll, wasn't it? Eugene Carroll? Yeah.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was.
He presented the medical, the military part of the defense, in which he went through the history of military involvements, we were operating from a necessity defense standard. Fascinating area of law, by the way, which I became more. So he gave the military history and why it was inconsistent for us to have a weapon that has to be first strike or it doesn't work, because it's okay. We had a pastor who was the head of the Baptist group in the South, and and his son was one of the defendants, who was a person who had been mugged and therefore was unable to speak because his vocal cords had been damaged. And while he was in jail, they refused him something to write on so that he could not communicate. A very interesting touch. And then there was, I guess there was me, to present the notion that people act according to their perception of danger. And so they, I did the research on that, how people have, how they respond to warning and whether or not it's effective, which it's not, and that sort of thing. It was a fascinating experience to sit in there because we had to present it under the condition of a motion in limine. The other side decided to try and eliminate the necessity defense. So we did the whole case without the jury, just in front of the judge. And when I was testifying and talking about how people face ultimate realities through denial, what I happened to know was that the prosecutor's daughter?
I was not. I know
can't
Carol
remember.
was there.
Anyway,
I wasn't there.
I think
yet.
it was his daughter who
there
had died of cancer, and he had been at her bedside about half a year before. She died of cancer with a peace banner behind her. She was active with the peace group, and so the psychology of that situation was a fascinating one, as I talked about how people face ultimate realities. And the prosecutor was trying to stay focused on his case, and I could see, this is where the psychologist comes in, I could see that his flashbacks were to, it was his sister, his dying sister. And it was a fascinating case. We did a wonderful job, all of us. And, I know. And Francis Boyle from the University of Chicago, who wrote the book on the necessity defense, gave a history of the necessity defense, which was the best legal lecture I have ever had. It was fascinating. It was a fascinating experience. It was not a success. Ultimately, the motion in limine was supported by the judge on the basis of a decision that was made in the next county and political pressure. Okay, this was a military area. But when he got up to say that he was going to he was going to support the motion in limine, he looked at the defense counsel and he said, you can appeal this. And he said it 3 times, which is just amazing. You can appeal this. All but please appeal this. Make me wrong. I felt like, Pontius Pilate just entered the room. That's fascinating. But I thought that we made a real impact on a lot of people just by what we did. And I, of course, thought I got a chance to interact with some fantastically informed human beings.
Very good, yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, now let's move over here to Don for a moment and have a few questions for him. Don, over the years you have been quite involved in professional activities with different groups, school psychologists, teachers, politicians, clinical psychologists. Has that ever led to any kind of role conflicts for you? Or has that been pretty seamless, you feel?
Yes.
To both of those.
Let me say, first of all, I've been retired for 29 years, so it's been a while. Things have changed a lot in education, but I used to write in reports why children needed, for instance, learning disability. Euclid was opposed to this. Euclid system was opposed to any change whatsoever. And I know I testified 6 times against, we'll say, the administration, okay? A couple years later, the federal government required that these things be done.
Very good.
Yeah. So,
However, he was not loved by his administration.
well, the parents went through the files and dug this stuff out, and the other ones, and actually, I think the thing has been overdone a lot. I saw a few kids, I think, that needed this particular kind of thing, and it's expanded incredibly. But anyway, other than that, there were times when I was mad at the superintendent where I think the real culprit was the assistant superintendent and so forth. But anyway, I altogether spent, 26 years in Euclid School stuff. Having worked for other places too, like Mansfield and Oberlin, Amherst, Wellington, but then I came back to Euclid. So I had that difficulty, and since then I retired and became very active, and I became active as of 1980 in demonstrating against the Reagan, Carter, Anderson group that were running for president. And after that time I became very active, stayed active for probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and then I
in politics, then.
yeah, and also I also did a lot of work. Sandra and I have done about 200 death penalty cases, and I did a lot of work with those. She's doing almost none now. Prosecutors are no longer spending money in going after the death penalty. So, but I did a lot of that thing as well as I served on the first of all, it was the Nuclear Weapons Freeze Board that became the Sane Freeze Board, the Peace Action Board. I served on that for better than 20 years, and I've done very little now for about the past 3 years.
But you still follow these areas, I'm sure, pretty
yeah,
actively.
right.
That's right, that's right. As far as some of the international organizations, I know both of you have been involved in those. Peace organizations, reaching out to other countries, better overall world relations. That must be something that you're still at least following to some degree.
I'm interested in that. Sandra attended the second meeting of the European Association of Psychology and Law and in Nuremberg in 1990. And since about 92, we've been going to those. They're interesting. Basically, she presents, I just go along. They're always held in a different city, in a different country, maybe Krakow, maybe somewhere in England. And they usually involve a dinner at a castle, a meeting with a mayor. And they're most interesting in that there are about a half dozen people from North America and 3 or 4 from Australia, and the rest 50 or 60 are Europeans. So we associate with Europeans. We have a great time. And we'll probably we'll see, go to France next year. Maybe.
Maybe things will be cooling down a little bit by then. I sure hope so. Yeah.
It's going to be held in Toulouse, and the good news is that I have a smattering of French, which I might really work to try and rehabilitate. The bad news is that Toulouse did get bombed once, and the question is, are they finished with Toulouse?
Right, yeah. Don, looking back at your professional career, same question I asked Sandy. What are you most proud of?
I served for many years on the Ohio School Psych Association Board in Santa Cruz, OPA. Frankly, you're thinking, Gary, of international or what?
And anything that to you, when you look back and let's say, everybody has a lengthy resume, both of you folks do, but if you want to say one thing that sort of stands out, maybe not even on your resume, it doesn't necessarily have to be in your resume, but that you look back and say, I'm really glad I did this, or I'm proud of this part of my career, or my life. A tough question, I know.
At the moment, I'm kind of at a loss. I kind of enjoyed what I was doing, and I'm sorry I can't really think of anything right now.
The peace movement, that's not always been a popular thing. Disarmament's not always been popular. So you've had a swim upstream on some of those.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting. For instance, you take the Ohio. I served as a representative from the Cleveland board, the Ohio board, and I was on the Ohio board. And that whole thing sort of died about 1991. Then we had to revive it. And we never tried to revive the Ohio board. We revived the Cleveland board about 94. It was very, very difficult. It's very much a going thing now. They're doing good work. But believe me, I guess people thought we had won about 1990, or they were too discouraged. So it was tough.
Yeah.
And I stayed involved as I was both the secretary and the chairman and the treasurer and everything.
Right, yeah.
Nowadays I do nothing except I'm the treasurer for the Cleveland Association of School Psychologists and for the Clinical Hypnosis Society.
Right.
That's it. That's all I'm doing right now.
Very good. Okay, well, this has been quite interesting. Anything else from either of you that you'd like to talk about or that we haven't covered here in our interview thus far?
Well, no, but one thing has occurred to me. You asked about young people and what kind of advice I would give on. One thing that occurs to me, something I used to tell my students all the time. I taught projectives, among other things, a lot of different assessment instruments, but I used to tell people, if you want to understand people and you try and rely on our psychological literature, you're probably not going to get there. So before you take, or part of taking my courses, you go to the art museum and you try and learn from the pictures that you see and from what you hear, what you can read about them as to what they're actually saying. And you go to the symphony and you read what the music is supposed to be conveying. And then you begin to understand something about what the human mind does and what its complexities are. And then you'll probably be able to hear your patients better. And so I sent all of my students out to the arts, basically. Same for film and for...
Really broadening their horizons.
Yeah. I don't think you can be a psychologist unless you happen also to have at least sampled the products of the best of our contributions to the world.
Yeah, very good. How about you, John? Anything else that we'd like to cover before we wind this up?
I think I'll just stick with what Sandra said. That's good enough. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both very much. It's been a delight to interview you, Dr. Sandra and Don McPherson, for the Ohio Psychological Association Oral History Project. Thank you again.
Thank you.